Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Night Without End by Alistair MacLean. Night Without End.
Chapter 3. Monday, 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Half a minute passed in complete silence, half a minute before I could trust myself to speak, even bring myself to speak. When at last I did, my voice was unnaturally low in unnatural hush that was broken only by the interminable clacking of the anemometer cups above. Splendid, really splendid, the perfect end to the perfect day. I looked round them slowly, one by one, then gestured at the smashed transmitter. What bloody idiot was responsible for this stroke of genius? How dare you, sir? The white-haired man whom I had mentally labeled as the Dixie Colonel took a step forward, face flushed with anger. Mind your tongue. We're not children to be dash. Shut up, I said, quietly enough, but there must have been something in my voice rather less than reassuring, for he fell silent, though his fists still remained clenched. I looked at them all again. Well, I'm afraid I did it, the stewardess faltered. Her brown eyes were as unnaturally large, her face as white and strained as when I had first seen her. It's all my fault. You, the one person here who should know just how vital radio really is. I don't believe it. You must, I'm afraid. The quiet, controlled voice belonged to the man with the cut brow. No one else was anywhere near it at the time. What happened to you? I could see he was nursing a bruised and bleeding hand. I dived for it when I saw it toppling. He smiled wryly. I should have saved myself the trouble. That damn thing's heavy. It's all that. Thanks for trying anyway. I'll fix your hand up later. I turned to the stewardess again, and not even that pale and exhausted face, the contrition in the eyes, could quieten my anger and, to be honest, my fear. I suppose it just came to pieces in your hand. I've told you I'm sorry. He was just kneeling beside Jimmy here, dash. Who? Jimmy Waterman, the second officer. I, dash. Second officer? I interrupted. That's the radio operator, I take it? No, Jimmy is a pilot. We've 3 pilots. We didn't carry a radio operator. You don't dash? I broke off my surprise question, asked another instead. Who's the man in the crew restroom? Navigator. We don't carry a navigator either. Harry Williamson was the flight engineer. No wireless operator, no navigator. There had been changes indeed since I'd flown the Atlantic some years, previously in a Stratocruiser. I gave it up, returned to my original question, and nodded at the smashed RCA. Well, how did it happen? I brushed the table as I rose, and, well, it just fell. Her voice trailed off uncertainly. It just fell. I echoed incredulously. 150 pounds of transmitter, and you flicked it off the table just like that? I didn't knock it off. The legs collapsed. It's got no legs to collapse, I said shortly. Hinges. Well, hinges then. I looked at Joss, who had been responsible for the erection of the table, as well as the radio. Is it possible? No. His voice was flat, definite. Again the silence in the cabin, the hush, the tension that grew from the merely uncomfortable to the all but unbearable. But I was beginning to see that there was nothing to be gained now by further questioning, much to be lost. The radio was wrecked. Finish. I turned away without a word, hung up my caribou furs on nails on the walls, took off goggles and gloves, and turned to the man with the cut brow. Let's have a look at your head and your hand. It's a pretty nasty gash on your forehead. Forget the radio for the moment. Joss, let's have coffee first, lots of it. I turned to Jack Straw, who had just come down the steps from the hatch and was staring at the smashed radio. I know, Jack Straw, I know. I'll explain later, not that I know anything about it. Bring empty cases for seats out of the food tunnel, will you? And a bottle of brandy. We all need it. I'd just started to wash the cut forehead, a nasty gash as I had said, but surprisingly little signs of bruising, when the big, amiable young man who had helped us lower the second officer from the wrecked plane came to us. I looked across up at him and saw that I could be wrong about the amiability. His face wasn't exactly hostile, but his eyes had the cool, measuring look of one who knew from experience that he could cope with most of the situations, pleasant and unpleasant, that he was ever likely to come up against. Look, he began without preamble. I don't know who you are or what your name is, but I'm sure we are all most grateful to you for what you have done for us. It's more than probable that we owe our lives to you. We acknowledge that. Also, we know you're a field scientist, and we realize that your equipment is of paramount importance to you. Agreed? Agreed. I dabbed iodine fairly liberally on the injured man's head. He was tough. All right, he didn't even wince, and looked at the speaker. Not at all a man to ignore, I thought. Behind the strong, intelligent face lay a hardness, a tenacity of purpose that hadn't been acquired along with the cultured, relaxed voice at the Ivy League college I was pretty certain he had attended. You'd something else to say? Yes, I think that you were unnecessarily rough on our air hostess. You can see the state the poor kid's in. Okay, so your radio's bust, so you're hopping mad about it, but there's no need for all this song and dance. His voice was calm, conversational all the time. Radios aren't irreplaceable. This one will be replaced, I promise you. You'll have a new one inside a week, 10 days at the most. Kind, I said dryly. I finished tying the head bandage and straightened up. The offer is appreciated, but there's one thing you haven't taken into account. You may be dead inside that 10 days. You may all be dead in 10 days. We may all dash, he broke off and stared at me, his expression perceptibly hardening. What are you talking about? What I'm talking about is that without this radio you dismiss so lightly our chances of survival aren't all that good. In fact, they're not good at all. I don't give a tuppenny damn about the radio as such. I eyed him curiously, and a preposterous thought struck me. At least it was preposterous for all of a couple of seconds before the truth hit me. Have any of you any idea just where you are, right here at the present moment? Sure we have. The young man lifted his shoulders fractionally. Just can't say how far to the nearest drugstore or pub dash. I told them. The stewardess interrupted. They were asking me just before you came in. I thought Captain Johnson had overshot the landing field at Reykjavik in a snowstorm. This is Langjökull, isn't it? She saw the expression on my face and went on hastily. Or Hofsjökull. I mean, we were flying more or less northeast from Gander, and these are the only 2 snowfields or glaciers or whatever you call them in Iceland in that direction from Dash. Iceland. I suppose there is a bit of the ham actor in all of us, and I really couldn't pass it up. Did you say Iceland? She nodded, dumbly. Everybody was looking at her, and when she didn't answer, they all transferred their gazes to me, as at the touch of a switch. Iceland, I repeated. My dear girl, at the present moment, you're at an altitude of 8,500 feet, right slam bang in the middle of the Greenland ice cap. The effect was all that anybody could ever have wished for. I doubt whether even Marie Lagarde had ever had a better reaction from an audience. Stunned is an inadequate word to describe their mental state immediately after this announcement. Paralysis was nearer it, especially where the power of speech was concerned. And when the power of thought and speech did return, it expressed itself, as I might have expected, in the most violent disbelief. Everybody seemed to start talking at once, but it was the stewardess who took my attention by coming forward and catching me by the lapels. I noticed the glitter of a diamond ring on her hand, and remember having some vague idea that this was against airline regulations. What kind of joke is this? It can't be. Greenland, it just can't be. She saw by the expression on my face that I wasn't joking, and her grip tightened even more. I had just time to be conscious of 2 conflicting thoughts, that wide with fear and dismay though they might be, she had the most extraordinarily beautiful brown eyes, and secondly, that the BOAC were slipping in their selection of stewardesses whose calmness in emergency was supposed to match the trimness of their appearance. Then she rushed on wildly. How can it be? We were on a Gander Reykjavik flight. Greenland. We didn't go anywhere near it. And there's the automatic pilot and radio beams and in radio base checks every half hour. Oh, it's impossible. Why do you tell us this? She was shaking now, whether from nervous strain or cold, I had no idea. The big young man with the Ivy League accent put an arm awkwardly round her shoulder, and I saw her wince. Something indeed seemed to be hurting her, but again it could wait. Joss, I called. He looked up from the stove, where he was pouring coffee into mugs. Tell our friends where we are. Latitude 72.40 north, longitude 40.10 east, Joss said unemotionally. His voice cut clearly through the hubbub of incredulous conversation. 300 miles from the nearest human habitation. 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Near enough 800 miles from Reykjavik, 1,000 from Cape Farewell, the southernmost point of Greenland, and just a little further distant from the North Pole. And if anyone doesn't believe us, sir, I suggest they just take a walk in any direction, and they'll find out who's right. Joss's calm, matter-of-fact statement was worth half an hour of argument and explanation. In a moment, conviction was complete, and there were more problems than ever to be answered. I held up my hand in mock protest and protection against the waves of questions that surged against me from every side. All in good time. Please, although I don't really know anything more than yourselves, with the exception, perhaps, of one thing. But first, coffee and brandy all round. Brandy. The expensive young woman had been the first, I'd noticed, to appropriate one of the empty wooden cases that Jackstraw had brought in lieu of seats, and now she looked up under the curve of exquisitely modeled eyebrows. Are you sure that's wise? The tone of her voice left little room for doubt as to her opinion. Of course. I forced myself to be civil. Bickering could reach intolerable proportions in a rigidly closed, mutually interdependent group, such as we were likely to be for some time to come. Why ever not? Opens the pores, dear man, she said sweetly. I thought everyone knew that. How dangerous it is when you're exposed to cold afterwards. Or had you forgotten? Our cases, our night things in the plane, somebody has to get these. Don't talk such utter rubbish. My short-lived attempt at civility perished miserably. Nobody's leaving here tonight. You sleep in your clothes. This isn't the Dorchester. If the blizzard dies down, we may try to get your things tomorrow morning. But Dash, if you're all that desperate, you're welcome to get them yourself. Want to try? It was boorish of me, but that was the effect she had. I turned away to see the minister or priest hold up his hand against the offered brandy. Go on, take it, I said impatiently. I don't really think I should. The voice was high-pitched, but the enunciation clear and precise, and I found it vaguely irritating that it should so perfectly match his appearance, be so exactly what I should have expected. He laughed, a nervous, deprecating laugh. My parishioners, you know. I was tired, worried, and felt like telling him what he could do with his parishioners, but it wasn't his fault. There's precedent in plenty in your Bible, Reverend. You know that better than I. It'll do you good, really. Oh, well, if you think so. He took the glass gingerly, as if Beelzebub himself were on the offering end, but I noticed that there was nothing so hesitant about his method and speed of disposal of the contents. His subsequent expression could properly be described as beatific. I caught Marie Lagarde's eye, and smiled at the twinkle I caught there. The Reverend wasn't the only one who found the coffee and brandy welcome. With the exception of the stewardess, who sipped at her drink in a distraught fashion, the others had also emptied their glasses, and I decided that the broaching of another Marteuse was justified. In the respite from the talk, I bent over the injured man on the floor. His pulse was slower, steadier, and his breathing not quite so shallow. I slipped in a few more heat pads and zipped up the sleeping bag. Is he any better, do you think? The stewardess was so close to me that I brushed against her as I straightened. He seems a bit better, doesn't he? He is a bit, I think, but nothing like over the shock from the wound and the exposure, though. I looked at her speculatively and suddenly felt almost sorry for her. Almost, but not quite. I didn't at all like the direction my thoughts were leading me. You've flown together quite a bit, haven't you? Yes. She didn't offer anything more. His head, do you think, Dash? Later. Let me have a quick look at that back of yours. Look at what? Your back, I said patiently. Your shoulders. They seem to give you some pain. I'll rig a screen. No, I'm all right. She moved away from me. Don't be silly, my dear. I wondered what trick of voice production made Marie Lagarde's voice so clear and carrying. He is a doctor, you know. No. I shrugged and reached for my brandy glass. Bearers of bad news were ever unpopular. I suppose her reaction was the modern equivalent of the classical despot's unsheathing his dagger. Probably only bruises. Anyhow, I told myself, and turned to look at the company. An odd-looking bunch, to say the least, but then any group of people dressed in lounge suits and dresses, Trilby hats and nylon stockings would have looked odd against the strange and uncompromising background of that cabin, where every suggestion of anything that even remotely suggested gracious living had been crushed and ruthlessly made subservient to the all-exclusive purpose of survival. Here there were no armchairs, no chairs, even no carpets, wallpaper, bookshelves, beds, curtains, or even windows for the curtains. It was a bleak utilitarian box of a room 18 feet by 14. The floor was made of unvarnished yellow pine. The walls were made of spaced sheets of bonded ply with kapok insulation between. The lower part of the walls was covered with green-painted asbestos, the upper part an entire roof sheeted with glittering aluminium to reflect the maximum possible heat and light. A thin, ever-present film of ice climbed at least halfway up all four walls. Reaching almost to the ceiling in the four corners, the parts of the room most remote from the stove, and therefore the coldest, on very cold nights, such as this, the ice reached Dollery's ceiling and started to creep across it to the layers of opaque ice that permanently framed the undersides of our rimed and opaque skylights. The two exits from the cabin were let into the 14-foot sides. One led to the trap, the other to the snow and ice tunnel where we kept our food, petrol, oil, batteries, radio generators, explosives for seismological and glacial investigations, and 101 other items. Halfway along, a secondary tunnel led off at right angles, a tunnel which steadily increased in length as we cut out the blocks of snow which were melted to give us our water supply. At the far end of the main tunnel lay our primitive toilet system. One 18-foot wall and half of the wall that gave access to the trapdoor were lined with twin rows of bunks, 8 in all. The other 18-foot wall was given over entirely to our stove, workbench, radio table, and housings for the meteorological instruments. The remaining wall by the tunnel was piled with tins and cases of food, now mostly empties, that had been brought in from the runnel to begin the lengthy process of defrosting. Slowly I surveyed all this, then as slowly surveyed the company. The incongruity of the contrast reached the point where one all but disbelieved. The evidence of one's own eyes, but they were there all right, and I was stuck with them. Everyone had stopped talking now, and was looking at me, waiting for me to speak, sitting in a tight semicircle round the stove. They were huddled together and shivering in the freezing cold. The only sounds in the room were the clacking of the anemometer cups, clearly audible down the ventilation pipe, the faint moaning of the wind on the ice cap, and the hissing of our pressure Coleman lamp. I sighed to myself and put down my empty glass. Well, it looks as if you are going to be our guests for some little time, so we'd better introduce ourselves. Us first. I nodded to where Joss and Jackstraw were working on the shattered RCA, which they had lifted back on the table. On the left, Joseph London, of the City of London, our radio operator. Unemployed, Joss muttered. On the right, Nils Nielsen. Take a good look at him, ladies and gentlemen. At this very moment, the guardian angels of your respective insurance companies are probably putting up a prayer F-46, are his continued well-being. If you all live to come home again, chances are that you will owe it to him. I was to remember my own words later. He probably knows more than any man living about survival on the Greenland ice cap. I thought you called him Jackstraw. Marie Lugard murmured. My Eskimo name. Jack Straw had turned and smiled at her, his parka hood off for the first time. I could see her polite astonishment as she looked at the fair hair, the blue eyes, and it was as if Jack Straw read her thoughts. Two of my grandparents were Danish. Most of us Greenlanders have as much Danish blood as Eskimo in us nowadays. I was surprised to hear him talk like this, and it was a tribute to Marie Lugard's personality. His pride in his Eskimo background was equaled only by his touchiness on the subject. Well, how interesting. The expensive young lady was sitting back on her box, hands clasped round an expensively nylon knee, her expression reflecting accurately the well-bred condescension of her tone. My very first Eskimo. Don't be afraid, lady. Jackstraw's smile was wider than ever, and I felt more than vaguely uneasy. His almost invariable Eskimo cheerfulness and good nature concealed an explosive temper which he'd probably inherited from some far-distant Viking forebear. It doesn't rub off. The silence that followed could hardly be described as companionable, and I rushed in quickly. My own name is Mason Peter Mason, and I'm in charge of this IGY station. You all know roughly what we're doing stuck out here on the plateau. Meteorology, glaciology, the study of the Earth's magnetism, the borealis, airglow, ionosphere, cosmic rays, magnetic storms, and a dozen other things which I suppose are equally uninteresting to you. I wave my arm. We don't, as you can see, normally live here alone. 5 others are away to the north on a field expedition. They're due back in about 3 weeks, after which we all pack up and abandon this place before the winter sets in and the ice pack freezes on the coast. Before the winter sets in, the little man in the Glenurquhart jacket stared at me. You mean to tell me it gets colder than this? It certainly does. An explorer called Alfred Wegener wintered not 50 miles from here in 1931, and the temperature dropped by 85 degrees below zero, 117 degrees of frost. And that may have been a warm winter for all we know. I gave some time to allow this cheering item of information to sink in, then continued. Well, that's us. Miss Lugard, Marie Lugard, needs no introduction from anyone. A slight murmur of surprise and turning of heads showed that I wasn't altogether right. But that's all I know, I'm afraid. Corazzini, the man with the cut brow, offered. The white bandage just staining with blood was in striking contrast to the receding dark hair. Nick Corazzini, bound for Bonnie, Scotland, as the travel posters put it. Holiday? No luck. He grinned, taking over the new global tractor company outside Glasgow. Know it? I've heard of it. Tractors, eh? Mr. Corazzini, you may be worth your weight in gold to us yet. We have a broken-down, elderly tractor outside that can usually only be started by repeated oaths and assaults by a 4-pound hammer. Well, he seemed taken aback. Of course, I can try dash. I don't suppose you've actually laid a finger on a tractor for many years. Marie Lugard interrupted shrewdly. Isn't that it, Mr. Corazzini? Afraid it is, he admitted ruefully. But in a situation like this, I'd gladly lay my hands on another one. You'll have your chance, I promised him. I looked at the man beside him. Smallwood, the minister announced. He rubbed his thin white hands constantly to drive the cold away. The Reverend Joseph Smallwood. I'm the Vermont delegate to the International General Assembly of the Unitarian and Free United Churches in London. You may have heard of it, our biggest conference in many years. Sorry, I shook my head, but don't let that disturb you. Our paper boy misses out occasionally, and you, sir? Solly Levin, of New York City, the little man in the check jacket added unnecessarily. He reached up and laid a proprietary arm along the broad shoulders of the young man beside him. And this is my boy, Johnny. Your boy? Your son. I fancied I could see a slight resemblance. Perish the thought, the young man drawled. My name is Johnny Zagero. Solly is my manager. Sorry to introduce a discordant note into company such as this. His eyes swept over us, dwelt significantly longer on the expensive young lady by his side dash, but I'm in the way of being a common or garden pugilist. That means boxer, Solly. Would you listen to him? Solly Levin implored. He stretched his clenched fists heavenwards. Would you just listen to him, apologizing? Johnny Zagero, future heavyweight champion, apologizing for being a boxer. The white hope for the world, that's all. Rated number 3 challenger to the champ. A household name in all dash. Ask Dr. Mason if he's ever heard of me, Zagero suggested. That means nothing, I smiled. You don't look like a boxer to me, Mr. Zagero, or sound like one. I didn't know it was included in the curriculum at Yale. Or was it Harvard? Princeton, he grinned. And what's so funny about that? Look at Tunney and his Shakespeare. Roland Lostarza was a college boy when he fought for the world title. Why not me? Exactly. Solly Levin tried to thunder the word, but he hadn't the voice for it. Why not? And when we've carved up this British champ of yours, a doddery old character rated number 2 challenger by one of the biggest injustices ever perpetrated in the long and glorious history of Washeen, when we've massacred this ancient has been, I say, dash. All right, Solly, Zagero interrupted. Desist. There's not a press man within 1,000 miles, save the golden words for later. Just keepin' in practice, boy. Words are 10 a penny. I've got thousands to spare, dash. 2 sands, Solly T-ousens. You're slippin'. Now shut up. Solly shut up, and I turned to the girl beside Zagero. Well, miss. Mrs. Dansby Gregg. You may have heard of me? No. I wrinkled my brow. I'm afraid I haven't. I'd heard of her all right, and I knew now that I'd seen her name and picture a score of times among those of other wealthy, unemployed, and unemployable built up by the tongue. In the cheek gossip columnists of the great national dailies, into an ersatz London society whose frenetic, frequently moronic, and utterly unimportant activities were a source of endless interest to millions. Mrs. Dansby Gregg, I seem to recall, had been particularly active in the field of charitable activities, although perhaps not so in dye production of the balance sheets. She smiled sweetly at me. Well, perhaps it's not so surprising after all. You are a bit distant from the center of things, aren't you? She looked across to where the youngster with the broken collarbone was sitting. And this is Fleming. Fleming. This time the wrinkling of my brow was genuine. You mean Helene? Fleming. My personal maid. Your personal maid, I said slowly. I could feel the incredulous anger stirring inside me. Your own maid? And you didn't even bother to volunteer to stay while I fixed her shoulder up? Miss Lugard did it first, she said coolly. Why should I? Quite right, Mrs. Dansby Gregg, why should you? Johnny Zajero said, approvingly. He looked at her long and consideringly. You might have got your hands dirty. For the first time, the carefully cultivated facade cracked, the smile stiffened mechanically, and her color deepened. Mrs. Dansby Gregg made no reply. Maybe she had none to make. People like Johnny Zajero never got close enough even to the fringes of her money-sheltered world for her to know how to deal with them. Well, that leaves just the two of you, I said hastily. The large Dixie colonel with the florid face and white hair was sitting next to the thin, wispy-haired little Jew. They made an incongruous pair. Theodore Mahler, the little Jew, said quietly. I waited, but he added nothing. A communicative character. Brewster, the other, announced. He made a significant pause. Senator Hoffman Brewster. Glad to help in any way I can, Dr. Mason. Thank you, Senator. At least I know who you are. Indeed, thanks to his magnificent flair for self-publicity, half the Western world knew who this outspoken, bitterly but fairly anti-communist, near-isolationist senator from the Southwest was. On a European tour? You might say that. He had the politician's gift for investing even the most insignificant words with a statesmanlike consideration. As chairman of one of our appropriation committees, let's call it a fact-finding tour. Wife and secretaries gone ahead by humble passenger steamer, I take it, Zajero said mildly. He shook his head. That was a fearful stink your congressional investigation boys raised recently about the expenses of U.S. senators abroad. That was quite unnecessary, young man, Brewster said coldly, and insulting. I believe it was, Zajero apologized, not really intended as such. Sorry, Senator. He meant it. What a bunch, I thought despairingly, what a crowd to be stuck with in the middle of the Greenland ice plateau. A business executive, a musical comedy star, a minister of religion, a boxer with an uninhibited if cultured tongue, his zany manager, a London society playgirl and her young German maid, a senator, a taciturn Jew, and a near-hysterical hostess, or one apparently so. And a gravely injured pilot who might live or die. But willy-nilly I was stuck with them, stuck with the responsibility of doing my damnedest to get these people to safety, and the prospect appalled me. How on earth was I even to start to go about it? Go about it with people with no Arctic clothing to ward off the razor-edged winds and inhuman cold, people lacking in all knowledge and experience of Arctic travel, even lacking, with 2 or 3 exceptions, the endurance and sheer muscular strength to cope with the savagery of the Greenland ice cap? I couldn't even begin to guess. But whatever else they were lacking in at that moment, it wasn't volubility. The life-giving warmth of the brandy had had the unfortunate side effect of loosening their tongues. Unfortunate, that is, from my point of view. They had 101 questions to ask, and they seemed to think that I should have the answer to all of them. More accurately, they had only half a dozen questions to ask, with 101 variations of these. How was it possible for a pilot to veer so many hundreds of miles off course? Could the compasses have gone wrong? Could the pilot have had a brainstorm? But then surely both co-pilot and second pilot would have known something was wrong? Could the radio have been damaged? It had been a bitterly cold afternoon even when they had left Gander. Was it possible that some of the naps and controls had iced up, forcing them off course? But if this were the case, why hadn't someone come to warn them of the possibility of the crash? I answered all of their questions as best I could, but these answers were all to the same effect, that I didn't really know anything more about it than they did. But you said some time ago that you did, perhaps, know one thing more than we did. It was Corazzini who put the question, and he was looking at me shrewdly. What was that, Dr. Mason? What? Ah, yes, I remember now. I hadn't forgotten, but the way things were shaping up in my mind, I'd had second thoughts about mentioning it, and had time to think up a plausible alternative. I need hardly tell you that it's nothing that I actually know, Mr. Corazzini. How could I wasn't in the plane? Just a reasonably informed guess in the absence of all other solutions. It's based on the scientific observations made here and in other IGY stations in Greenland, some of them over the past 18 months. For over a year now, we have been experiencing a period of intense sunspot activity. That's one of the main interests of the IGY year, the most intense of this century. As you may know, sunspots, or rather, the emission of solar particles from these sunspots, are directly responsible for the formation of the aurora borealis and magnetic storms, both of these being related to disturbances in the ionosphere. These disturbances can, and actually almost invariably do, interfere with radio transmission and reception, and when severe enough can completely disrupt all normal radio communications. And they can also produce temporary alterations of the Earth's magnetism, which knock magnetic compasses completely out of kilter, all of which was true enough as far as it went. It would, of course, require extreme conditions to produce these effects, but we have been experiencing these lately, and I'm pretty sure that that's what happened with your plane, where astral navigation by the stars, that is impossible. As it was on a night like this, you are dependent on radio and compasses as your two main navigational aids. If these are knocked out, what have you left? A fresh hubbub of talk arose at this, and though it was quite obvious that most of them had only a vague idea what I was talking about, I could see that this idea was finding a fair degree of ready acceptance, satisfying them and fitting the facts as they knew them. I saw Joss gazing at me with an expressionless face, looked him in the eye for a couple of seconds, then turned away. As a radio operator, Joss knew even better than I that, though there was still some sunspot activity, it had reached its maximum in the previous year. And as an ex-aircraft radio operator, he knew that airliners flew on gyro compasses, which neither sunspots nor magnetic storms could ever affect in the slightest. We'll have something to eat now. I cut through the buzz of conversation. Any volunteers to give Jackstraw a hand? Certainly. Marie Lagarde, as I might have guessed, was first on her feet. I'm by way of being what you might call a mean cook. Lead me to it, Mr. Nielsen. Thanks. Joss, you might give me a hand to rig a screen. I nodded at the injured pilot. We'll see what we can do for this boy here. The stewardess, unbidden, moved forward to help me also. I was on the point of objecting, -1 knew that this wasn't going to be nice, but I didn't want trouble with her, not yet. I shrugged my shoulders and let her stay. Half an hour later, I had done all I could. It indeed hadn't been nice, but both the patient and the stewardess had stood it far better than I had expected. I was fixing and binding on a stiff leather helmet to protect the back of his head, and Joss was strapping him down inside the sleeping bag to the stretcher so that he couldn't toss around and hurt himself when the stewardess touched my arm. What do you think now, Dr. Mason? It's hard to be sure. I'm not a specialist in brain or head injuries, and even a specialist would hesitate to say. The damage may have penetrated deeper than we think. There may be hemorrhaging, it's often delayed in these cases. But if there's no hemorrhaging, she persisted, if the damage is no worse than what you think, what you see, 50-50. I wouldn't have said so a couple of hours ago, but he seems to have quite astonishing powers of resistance and recuperation. Better than an even chance, I would say if he had the warmth, the food, the skilled nursing he would have in a first-class hospital. As it is, well, let's leave it at that, shall we? Yes, she murmured. Thank you. I looked at her, looked at the washed-out face, the faint blue circles forming under her eyes, and almost felt touched with pity. Almost. She was exhausted and shivering with cold. Bet, I said, you're dying for sleep and warmth. Miss, I am so sorry. I forgot to ask your name. Ross. Margaret Ross. Scots. Irish. Southern Irish. I won't hold it against you. I smiled. There was no answering smile from her. Tell me, Miss Ross, why was the plane so empty? We had an X flight, an extra or duplicate charter for an overflow of passengers out from London yesterday. Day before yesterday, it is now, I suppose. We just stayed the night in Idlewild and had to return after we'd slept. The office phoned up people who had booked out on the evening plane, giving the chance of an earlier flight. 10 of them accepted. I see. By the way, isn't it a bit unusual to have only one stewardess aboard? On a transatlantic flight, I mean. I know. There's usually 2 or 3, a steward and 2 stewardesses, or 2 stewards and a stewardess, but not for 10 people. Of course. Hardly worth stewarding, you might say. Still, I went on smoothly. It at least gives you time for the odd 40 winks on these long night flights. That wasn't fair. I hadn't been as clever as I thought, and her white cheeks were stained with red. That's never happened to me before. Never. Sorry, Miss Ross. It wasn't really meant as a dig. It doesn't matter anyhow. It does so matter. Her extraordinary brown eyes were bright, with unshed tears. If I hadn't been asleep, I would have known what was going to happen. I could have warned the passengers. I could have moved Colonel Harrison to a front seat, facing the rear dash. Colonel Harrison? I interrupted sharply. Yes, the man in the back seat, the dead man. But he hadn't a uniform on when dash. I don't care. That was his name on the passenger list. If I'd known, he wouldn't be dead now, and Miss Fleming wouldn't have had her collarbone broken. So that's what has been worrying her, I thought. That accounts for her strange, distraught behavior. And then, a moment later, I realized that it didn't account for it all. She had been behaving like that before ever she had known what had happened to any of the passengers. My slowly forming suspicions came back with renewed force. The lady would bear watching. You've nothing to reproach yourself with, Miss Ross. The captain must have been flying blind in the storm, and we're more than 8,000 feet up here. Probably he'd no knowledge of what was going to happen until the actual moment of crashing. In my mind's I saw again the doomed airliner, landing lights on, circling our cabin for at least 10 minutes, but if Miss Ross had any such thing in her minds, it was impossible for me to detect it. She had no idea at all, or she was an extraordinarily good actress. Probably, she murmured dully, "I don't know." We had a hot and satisfying meal of soup, corned meat, potatoes, and vegetables, everything out of cans, but passable enough for all that. It was the last satisfying meal that our guests, or ourselves for that matter, were likely to have for some considerable time to come, but I felt the moment unpropitious for breaking that sort of news. Time enough for that tomorrow or later in the day, rather, for it was now already after 3 o'clock in the morning. I suggested that the four women sleep in the top bunks, not from any delicacy of sentiment, but because it was at least 25 degrees warmer there than it was at ground level, and the proportional difference would increase as the night wore on after the stove had been put out. There were some half-hearted protests when they learnt that I intended to shut down the fire, but I didn't even bother arguing with them. Like all people who have lived for any length of time in the Arctic, I had an almost pathological dread of fire. Margaret Ross, the stewardess, refused the offer of a bunk and said she would sleep by the injured pilot, lest he should wake and want anything during the night. I had intended doing that myself, but I saw her mind was set on it, and though I felt unaccountably uneasy about the idea, I raised no objection. That left 5 empty bunks among 6 men, Jackstraw, Joss, and I could sleep reasonably enough in our furs. Inevitably, there was some magnanimous argument over the allocation of these bunks, but Corzini settled the argument by producing a coin and beginning to toss for it. He himself lost in the end, but accepted defeat and the prospect of a cold, uncomfortable night on the floor with amiable grace. When they were all settled down, I picked up a torch and our weather log book, glanced at Joss, and made for the trap. Zagero turned in his bunk to look at me. "What gives, Dr. Mason? Especially at this hour of night, what gives?" "Weather reports, Mr. Zagero. That's why we're here, remember? And I'm already 3 hours late with these." "Even tonight?" "Even tonight. Continuity is the most important thing in weather observation. Sooner you than me." He shivered. "If it's only half as cold outside as it is in here." He turned his back, and Joss rose to his feet. He'd correctly interpreted my look, and I knew he was consumed with curiosity. "'Til come with you. Sir, better have a last look at the dogs." We didn't bother looking at either the dogs or the weather instruments. We went straight towards the tractor and huddled under the tarpaulin for what miserable shelter it could afford. True, the wind had eased, but it was colder than ever. The long winter night was beginning to close down on the ice cap. "It stinks," Joss said flatly. "The whole setup stinks." To high heaven, I agreed, but it's finding out where the smell comes from that the trouble lies. "This fairy tale of yours about magnetic storms and compasses and radios," he went on, "what was the idea?" I'd previously said I knew something they didn't. I did, but when it came to the bit, I knew I'd be better to keep it to myself. You know how this damnable cold slows up your mind, minus one should have realized it sooner. Realized what? That I should keep it to myself. Keep what, for heaven's sake? Sorry, Joss. not trying to build up suspense. The reason none of them knew anything about the crash until after it had happened is that they were all doped. As far as I could see, all of them, or nearly all, were under the influence of some sleeping drug or narcotic. In the darkness, I could almost feel him staring at me. After a long time, he said softly, "You wouldn't say this unless you were sure of it." I am sure of it. Their reactions, their dazed fumbling back to reality, and above all, the pupils of their eyes, unmistakable. Some kind of sleeping tablet, mixtures of the fast-acting kind. What is known to the trade, I believe, as Mickey fins. But Dash just broke off. He was still trying to orientate his mind to this new line of thought. But they would be bound to know of it, to be aware that they had been doped when they came to... In normal circumstances, yes. But they came to in what was, to say the least, most abnormal circumstances. I'm not saying that they didn't experience any symptoms of weakness, dizziness, and lassitude. They must have done, and what more natural than that they should ascribe any such unusual physical or mental symptoms to the effects of the crash? And what more natural, too, than that they should conceal these symptoms as best they could and refrain from mentioning them? They would be ashamed to admit or discuss weaknesses. It's a very human trait to show to your neighbors the very best face you can put on in times of emergency or danger. Joss didn't reply at once. The implications of all this, as I'd found out for myself, took no little time for digestion. So I let him take his time and waited, listening to the lost and mournful wailing of the wind, the rustling hiss of millions of ice spicules scudding across the frozen snow of the ice cap, and my own thoughts were in keeping with the bleak misery of the night. "It's not possible," Joss muttered at length. I could hear his teeth chattering with the cold. "You can't have some maniac rushing around an aircraft cabin with a hypo needle or dropping fizzballs into their gin and tonics. You think they were all doped?" "Just about." "But how could anyone dash?" "A moment, Joss," I interrupted. "What happened to the RCA?" "What?" The sudden switch caught him momentarily off balance. "What happened? You mean, how did it go for a Burton?" "I've no idea at all. Sir, all I know is that these hinges couldn't have been knocked into the wall accidentally, not with radio and equipment weighing about 180 pounds sitting on top of them. Someone shoved them in. Deliberately. And the only person anywhere near it at the time was the stewardess, Margaret Ross. Everyone agreed on that." "Yes, but why in the name of heaven should anyone want to do a crazy thing like that?" "I don't know," I said wearily. "There's 100 things I don't know. But I do know she did it. And who's in the best position to spike the drinks of aircraft passengers? Good God." I could hear the sharp hissing intake of breath. "Of course, drinks, or maybe the sweets they hand out at takeoff." "No." I shook my head definitely in the darkness. "Barley sugar is too weak a covering-up agent to disguise the taste of a drug. Coffee, more likely." "It must have been her," Joss said slowly. "It must have been. But she acted as dazed and abnormal as any of the others. More so, if anything. Maybe she'd reason to," I said grimly. "Come on, let's get back or we'll freeze to death. Tell Jack Straw when you get him by himself." Inside the cabin, I propped the hatch open a couple of inches, with 14 people inside. Extra ventilation was essential. Then I glanced at the thermograph. It showed 48 degrees below zero, 80 degrees of frost. I lay down on the floor, pulled my parka hood tight to keep my ears from freezing, and was asleep in a minute.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.